Long after the world stopped listening to him, a black veteran found something the military could never replicate, a heartbeat that refused to quit. The snow hid more than footprints that night. It hid proof that humanity's greatest experiment had failed, and mercy had outlived control. Stay with us, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching, because once you hear what that dog did, you'll understand why some promises are written in scars. The storm had no mercy that night, hammering its fists against the roof of a crooked cabin lost in the Wyoming backwoods. Inside Ray Mathers, a 68-year-old black veteran sat hunched beside a flickering oil lantern, the glow tracing the deep lines across his weathered face. His hands, once steady enough to stitch torn flesh in battle, now shook from the cold and from age. He wore an old Army medic's jacket, sleeves torn, patches faded, the only proof of who he used to be. Everything else that once defined him, purpose, company, pride, had long since slipped away like smoke in winter wind. The world had forgotten his name, but tonight the storm hadn't. It reminded him he was still alive, if only to feel the ache of it. Near the door, curled against the draft, lay his last companion Scout, a wounded German shepherd with dull eyes and a body too thin to fight the cold. The old dog was more bone than muscle, now his fur patchy, one paw twisted from an old injury that never healed right. Each breath he took rattled softly, and the sound tore through Ray's chest like shrapnel. "You hang in there, boy," he murmured, voice cracked and tired. He ran his calloused fingers over the dog's head, tracing the scar that cut across the animal's muzzle. "You and me, we've come through worse, haven't we?" he whispered, though even he didn't believe it anymore. The lantern flickered again, struggling to stay alive against the wind, and in that dim light, Ray's brown eyes drifted to the shelf, lined with dusty medicine bottles, most empty, the rest useless. He had tried everything to keep Scout's infection from spreading, but the wound in the dog's leg had turned black weeks ago. The vet had said there was nothing to be done without surgery, and surgery cost money. Ray had none left. The government checks were late again, and his bank account was an echo. He had stopped asking for help years ago. People didn't help old soldiers anymore. They thanked them with words, not with warmth. The wind screamed louder, and the cabin shuddered. Scout lifted his head slightly, eyes cloudy but alert. "Easy," Ray said, patting the blanket beside him. But Scout didn't relax. His ears twitched, pointing towards the window as if catching something Ray couldn't. The storm roared outside, swallowing everything, and then cutting through it came a sound so faint, Ray thought he imagined it at first. A cry, high-pitched, short, then again, louder, sharper. Not human, not thunder. A puppy. Ray stiffened his pulse, quickening despite the years. He pushed himself up from the chair, his bad knee locking for a second before giving way. "No," he muttered. "No, that's not our fight." But Scout moved before he could finish. The old dog dragged himself up, his claws scraping the wooden floor tail, trembling behind him. He limped toward the door, weak, but determined, his body a map of scars, yet still willing to serve. "You can't go out there," Ray said, voice rising over the storm. "You'll freeze before you make it 10 feet. Scout ignored him, pressing his muzzle against Ray's leg, eyes glassy, yet fierce, as if saying, "We can't leave it out there." Ray hesitated, torn between logic and the ache in his chest. He'd sworn off the world after the war, no more saving, no more bleeding for strangers. But something about that cry cut through all the walls he'd built. It was the same sound he'd heard too many times before, a voice too small to fight for itself. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his rifle and flashlight, and wrapped his scarf tight around his neck. "Fine," he said, "but if we're doing this, we do it together." Scout wagged his tail once, a weak, ghostly motion, before following his master to the door. The cold hit like a punch when Ray opened it. Wind and rain exploded inside, snuffing out the lantern flame. He stepped into the storm, his flashlight beam slicing through the downpour. Scout stayed close, limping, his fur already soaked through. The woods beyond the cabin were pitch black, every tree swaying like it wanted to fall. The cry came again, clearer now, ahead and to the left. Ray aimed the light and saw something glint beneath the brush. He trudged forward, knees screaming with each step, mud swallowing his boots. Scout followed silently, eyes scanning the darkness like a soldier on watch. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant Ray saw it, a tiny bundle of black and white fur, trembling beneath a fallen log. The puppy was curled into itself, shivering so hard its body looked like it might break apart. "Easy, little one," Ray whispered, crouching low. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling from both cold and fear that he was too late. The puppy whimpered, too weak to move. Scout approached beside him, lowering his head to sniff. The old shepherd gave a soft whine, almost a lullaby, then gently nudged the pup with his nose. The puppy stirred, blinking through rain, and gave the faintest whimper back. "Good boy," Ray said softly to Scout. "You found it." Then the thunder cracked again, rolling across the valley. But underneath it, Ray heard something else. A low growl, far away but real. Not the wind, not thunder. Something was watching them. He turned his flashlight toward the tree line, heart hammering. For a second he thought he saw movement, a shape slipping between shadows. His grip tightened on the rifle. The sound vanished. Only rain and wind remained. "Come on," he muttered, lifting the pup carefully and wrapping it inside his jacket. Scout limped beside him as they started back towards the cabin. The pup's heartbeat was rapid against his chest, fragile, but still there. He felt it, that pulse of life. And for the first time in years he felt something else, too hope. When they reached the cabin, Ray shut the door behind them, bolted it twice, and placed the puppy beside the fire. He dried its fur with an old towel, while Scout lay down, wheezing, eyes still fixed on the door, as if guarding against the storm. The pup whimpered once and pressed itself against Scout's chest, seeking warmth. The old shepherd licked its head gently, then rested his chin beside it. The firelight caught them both, the dying dog and the newborn life he'd insisted on saving. Ray sat back, staring, his throat tight. "You're one hell of a soldier," he whispered to Scout. "Even when you've got nothing left, you still find someone else to fight for." Scout hadn't moved much since dawn. The old shepherd slept beside the pup, his chest rising and falling unevenly, one paw resting protectively across the tiny creature's back. The image pierced something deep in Ray, that familiar ache between loss and duty. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Scout so alert, even in his weakness refusing to rest, completely, always guarding. Maybe it reminded him of the war, of the nights he'd stood over wounded men, refusing to close his eyes in case one of them didn't wake up. The smell of rain and smoke filled the air, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe the worst had passed. Then he noticed the door. The mud around the threshold bore fresh tracks. Not his, not Scout's. He crouched, tracing the edge of a boot print, deep, heavy, and recent. Someone had been outside during the night. His heart tightened. The feeling of being watched hadn't been a trick of the storm. He checked the lock again, then turned toward Scout. "You feel that too, don't you?" he muttered. Scout's ears twitched even in half-sleep. The dog knew. They both knew. Ray poured what little coffee he had left into a thermos, grabbed his rifle, and loaded 3 rounds. The puppy stirred when he moved, letting out a faint cry, softer now, but it still trembled through the quiet, like a plea. "Easy, little one," Ray said, kneeling to stroke its damp fur. "You're safe. Just stay with him." He glanced at Scout, who gave a small grunt of acknowledgement, as if accepting the order. Ray had no idea why someone would abandon a pup in that storm, but the way Scout had reacted last night, the growling, the way he'd stood guard after the rescue, told him it wasn't just neglect. There was something else out there. Something that didn't want to be found. He stepped outside, into the mist, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The forest dripped quietly, water sliding off pine needles like whispers. Every step forward felt heavier than the last. The fog blurred the edges of everything, but Ray's instincts sharpened. The medic in him had gone quiet years ago, but the soldier never truly left. He followed the faint trail downhill, the direction from which he'd first heard the cries. The ground was torn up in places, tire tracks mixed with animal prints. The deeper he went, the more uneasy he felt. The silence was too complete, like the woods were holding their breath. Then, About 100 yards from the cabin, he saw it a glint of metal under a mound of wet branches. He brushed the pine needles away, and the shape revealed itself piece by piece, a rusted cage twisted on one side, half buried in mud. The lock was broken, but what made his stomach tighten wasn't the rust. It was the dark stain smeared along the bars, deep red against the silver. Blood. Fresh enough that the rain hadn't fully washed it away. He leaned closer, his breath fogging in the cold. Whoever had been here hadn't just abandoned animals. They'd done something worse. He crouched lower, scanning the ground around it. More boot prints, heavy ones. 2 people, maybe 3. The tracks led deeper into the trees and then vanished into a slope of rock and mud. He touched the side of the cage again and found something wedged beneath the door, a torn piece of blue fabric with stitching along the edge. It wasn't from a uniform or gear, it was from a blanket, and embroidered on it, nearly invisible beneath the grime, was a single word: hope. His throat tightened as he turned it over in his hand. "Someone cared enough to name you," he whispered, though the only answer was the wind. He looked back toward the path, but something about the air shifted. The forest went still again, completely still. Not a bird, not even the drip of water. His instincts screamed before his mind caught up. He raised his rifle and scanned the tree line. That was when he heard the snap, a twig breaking somewhere behind him. He spun finger on the trigger. Nothing. Just fog. The silence returned, pressing in on him, until it felt like the woods themselves were watching. He backed up slowly, keeping the rifle steady. Then he saw it faint, at first, between the trees, a reflection. A lens. Someone was out there with binoculars, or a scope hidden in the mist. Ray took 2 careful steps backward, heart hammering, but then the reflection was gone, swallowed by fog. He didn't wait. He turned and made his way uphill, rifle, ready eyes never leaving the tree line. Whoever it was, they weren't hunters, and they weren't lost. When he finally reached the cabin again, Scout was standing, wobbling on weak legs, his body tense. The puppy barked softly, sensing the tension. Ray closed the door behind him and slid the lock. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Scout limped forward, sniffing the air near Ray's boots. The smell of blood still clung to them. Ray set the torn blanket on the table and stared at the stitched name. The thread was frayed, the edges burned like someone had tried to destroy it. He poured a bit of warm milk into a pan for the puppy, who crawled toward it eagerly, tail wagging faintly. The sight cracked something inside him, how something so small could still fight for life after everything. "Hope," Ray murmured, glancing at the name again. "That's what they called you, huh?" The puppy paused mid-sip, looking up at him with wide, glassy eyes. For a brief moment, the cabin felt almost human, again warmth, breath the soft rhythm of life returning. But it didn't last. A dull, metallic thud echoed outside, faint but deliberate. Ray froze. It wasn't thunder this time. It was metal hitting metal somewhere near the shed out back. Scout growled low, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Ray picked up his rifle again and moved to the window. Through the mist, he could barely see the outline of the shed, the door slightly ajar. He aimed the flashlight beam toward it, and the light caught movement, a shadow slipping behind the structure. Then nothing. Just fog. He stood there, silent, finger resting lightly on the trigger. After a long moment, he whispered, "They're not just watching, they're waiting." Behind him, Scout limped to the window, pressing his muzzle against the glass. His breathing was labored, but his eyes burned with something fierce, something familiar, the same defiance that had carried him through explosions and pain. Ray placed a hand on the dog's back. "We'll find out who they are," he said quietly, "but not today." He looked at the puppy still drinking from the pan, tiny body shaking from exhaustion, yet still alive. "We protect her first. That's the mission." Scout gave a soft grunt in agreement. As the fog thickened outside, the cabin grew still again, save for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the chimney. Ray sat near the door, rifle across his lap, keeping watch, while the 2 dogs slept side by side. His eyelids grew heavy, but he fought the pull of sleep. Every time the floor creaked, every gust of wind, he tightened his grip on the weapon. Somewhere out there in the pines, the watchers waited, and Ray knew this was only the beginning. The forest was too quiet, and in a veteran's mind, silence was never safety, it was a warning. Inside, the puppy named Hope slept beside the fire, nestled against Scout's chest, her tiny frame rising and falling with his steady but weakened rhythm. Ray kept the window cracked open so he could hear if either of them stirred. He didn't like being this far from them, but every instinct told him he needed to know what was moving out there, before it found them first. The ground was slick with frost, the kind that squeaked under boots, and his hands gripped the rifle like an old friend he wished he didn't need. His eyes darted through the mist, tracing shapes that weren't really there. For the first time since the war, he felt that old tension crawling up his spine, the one that whispered you were being watched long before you saw who was watching. He didn't have to wait long to be proven right. The wind shifted slightly, and something metallic flashed faintly through the fog, a reflection that shouldn't have been there. He squinted, heart hammering, and took one careful step toward the tree line. That's when it happened. 2 red dots appeared out of nowhere, cutting through the mist like eyes. Laser sights. The breath froze in his lungs. He dove to the ground as a rifle cracked the bullet, splintering the pine trunk behind him, sending bark flying across his jacket. Instinct took over. He rolled, brought his rifle up, and fired 1 round into the fog. No sound came back except the echo of the shot vanishing into the emptiness. He waited, muscles coiled tight, finger ready. The forest remained still. Whoever had fired first wasn't retreating, they were repositioning. He crawled behind a log, forcing himself to breathe slow. The sound of his heartbeat thundered in his ears. Another shot rang out closer this time, whizzing past his shoulder and burying itself in the dirt inches from his hand. "Damn it," he hissed, pressing himself flat. The shot hadn't been meant to kill. It was meant to scare or warn. But of what, he couldn't tell. He took a slow look back toward the cabin, its faint light glowing warm through the fog. And that's when his stomach twisted. The front door was open. He hadn't left it that way. "No," he muttered under his breath, pushing himself up and sprinting through the clearing. Every step felt heavier than the last. He reached the porch rifle, raised his breath short. The door hung half open, creaking softly in the cold wind. Inside, Scout was on his feet, teeth bared, fur raised despite his exhaustion. Hope was still by the fire, but she was trembling, eyes wide and fixed on the window. Ray stepped inside, slowly shutting the door with his boot. "You saw them too," he whispered to Scout, and the dog gave a low growl that vibrated deep in his chest. There was something primal in it, something Ray hadn't heard in years, the sound of a protector willing to die before letting danger near what it loved. He looked out the window again, seeing nothing but white. Yet the weight of the unseen pressed against the glass, thick and unrelenting. Whoever they weren't just passing by. He backed away from the window, double-checking the rifle's chamber. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, as if the air itself was closing in. The puppy whimpered softly. Scout moved immediately, limping closer to her, resting his muzzle gently on her head until she stopped shaking. Watching that broke something in Ray. In another life, in another body, he had done the same thing, kneeling beside the dying and the scared, telling them it would be all right, even when it wasn't. But here, watching a broken animal comfort one even smaller, it hit him how unfair the world could be. How survival always seemed to demand the gentle ones pay first. A sound outside yanked him back, a slow crunch of boots in snow. This time it wasn't far. They were circling. He turned off the lantern, letting the fire's glow fade until the cabin was cast in shadows. The dark made the sounds sharper, the soft drag of fabric, the faint click of metal. He crouched beside the door rifle, aimed low, waiting. Scout stood beside him, trembling, but ready, his good ear twitching toward the sound. The moment stretched thin, seconds turning to minutes. Then a whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but there were at least 2 voices, low and certain. The doorknob moved slightly, just once, testing. Ray raised the rifle higher finger against the trigger. The knob turned again, harder this time, and then came stillness. Another second. Then footsteps receding, slow, deliberate, not in panic but in patience. They were toying with him. Ray waited 5 full minutes before moving, muscles aching from tension. He reached up and pulled the curtain aside an inch. The fog swallowed everything. Then from somewhere out there, a small red dot danced across the glass, quick, sharp, deliberate, before vanishing. He pulled back immediately, adrenaline flooding through him. Whoever they were, they wanted him to know they could see him even when he couldn't see them. That was worse than being hunted. That was being studied. Scout's breathing grew harsh again, his body trembling from pain and fear, yet he refused to lie down. He barked once, hoarse, but loud, breaking the silence. The sound echoed through the woods, and Ray winced, knowing it might draw fire. But what happened next he couldn't have predicted. The puppy, tiny and fragile, crawled from the blanket to sit beside Scout, pressing her tiny head against his leg. The gesture was so small, so pure, that Ray felt something sting behind his eyes. "You two are a mess," he whispered softly, lowering the rifle for a moment. "But hell, if you're not the bravest damn things I've ever seen." The moment didn't last. A shot cracked from outside, shattering the window in a burst of glass. Ray dropped to the floor, dragging Scout and the puppy behind the couch. Splinters rained down, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Another bullet punched through the wall, hitting the metal stove and sparking. Then silence again. Ray breathed hard, heart pounding, and dared to peek through the jagged hole in the glass. Nothing. The fog had swallowed everything once more. He sat back, chest heaving, and looked down at the dog lying beside him. Scout's eyes were wide, but focused, his chest rising fast. "You saved me again," Ray murmured. The bullet that shattered the window had been aimed higher at his head level. If Scout hadn't lunged at that second, pressing his body against Ray's, it would have hit its mark. Scout let out a weak groan, his body trembling from the effort. Ray placed his hand over the old dog's chest, feeling the heartbeat still there, strong, stubborn, alive. Hope whimpered and climbed onto Scout's side, licking his muzzle, and the old shepherd closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. Ray swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He reloaded the rifle and whispered, "They won't take another shot tonight." They got their message across. He knew the type. Whoever these men were, they weren't killers for sport. They were professionals marking territory. They were warning him to stay quiet or stay gone. But they'd made one mistake. They'd shot at a soldier who'd spent a lifetime learning how to survive warnings. The morning after the attack was unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. The fog had begun to thin, but the air still hung damp and pale with the chill of uncertainty. Ray Mathers hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, with his rifle leaning against his leg, a cold cup of coffee untouched in front of him. Every sound made his nerves tighten, the drip from the roof, the pop of a cooling log in the fire, even the faint stirring of wind through the pines. He kept glancing toward the window, half expecting another red beam to cut through the morning haze. Scout lay beside the door, his fur matted with dried blood from the night before. The old shepherd's breathing came uneven, shallow, but his eyes never left the threshold. Even wounded, he wouldn't rest. That stubborn loyalty made Ray's chest ache in a way no bullet ever had. Hope, the tiny puppy, was curled up against Scout's neck, sleeping as if the night's chaos had been nothing more than a bad dream. Ray watched her breathe and felt that fragile, almost unbearable pull of protectiveness again. He had been a medic for years, seen men die in his arms, but something about this little creature's trust, it undid him in ways he couldn't explain. He got up slowly, wincing as his knee locked with pain, and crossed the room to the cabinet above the counter. Inside was a small black box, his old field camera kit. He'd set up the motion sensors weeks ago, back when raccoons were his biggest problem. Now he needed them for something much darker. He carried the box to the table, wiped off the dust, and began connecting the wires to the small monitor. The screen flickered, then steadied into a grainy image of the cabin's perimeter. He rewound the footage from the night before. At first, there was nothing, just trees shifting in the wind and the soft static of night. Then two shadows appeared from the left side of the frame. They moved slowly, deliberately. Both were men, faces hidden behind masks, bodies heavy with gear. One carried what looked like a rifle, but the other— Ray froze the image and leaned closer. The second man wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding a tranquilizer gun. Not meant to kill, but to capture. Ray's stomach twisted. They weren't just harassing him. They were hunting for something specific, something they wanted alive. His gaze shifted toward the puppy sleeping beside Scout. He hit play again. The footage showed the men circling the cabin twice, checking angles, then disappearing into the fog near the ridge. No attempt to break in, no shots fired, just observation. It was reconnaissance. "You bastards are studying us," he muttered under his breath, jaw tightening. He turned off the monitor and looked toward the fire where the two dogs lay. Scout stirred weakly, sensing the shift in Ray's voice. "They'll come back," Ray said quietly, "and next time they won't miss." Scout tried to lift his head, failed, then pushed again until he managed to rise on trembling legs. The dog's resilience tore at Ray's composure. "Lie down," he whispered, but Scout ignored him, limping toward the window to look out, his nose pressed to the glass. Hope followed clumsily, her tiny paws tapping the floor, trying to copy his posture. Ray's throat tightened at the sight, an old broken soldier teaching a newborn how to stand guard. He spent the next hour patching the holes in the walls, boarding the shattered window, and checking his ammunition. He knew this cabin, every creak and flaw, every place to hide or shoot from. It wasn't much, but it was home, and now it was a fortress. The snow outside began to fall in soft flakes, silent and deceptive, blanketing the chaos of the night before. When he finally sat down again, exhaustion clawed at him. He poured a little water into a bowl for the puppy and tore a strip of jerky for Scout, but the old dog refused to eat. Instead, he nudged the bowl toward Hopetail, twitching once as if to insist she go first. Ray smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You always were the kind that fed everyone else before yourself," he murmured. The pup sniffed at the water, hesitated, then took a small sip. Scout watched her closely, and when she was done, he lowered himself slowly, pressing his muzzle against her face. The little dog whimpered softly, then relaxed, letting out a tiny, peaceful sigh that filled the cabin with warmth, despite the cold pressing against the walls. That moment, so small, so pure, nearly broke Ray. He reached out and stroked Scout's back, his rough hand trembling. "You're still doing it," he whispered, "still saving lives." Scout's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, and for a heartbeat, it was as if the years peeled away, leaving behind only the bond between a man and the dog that had carried him through the worst of life. But outside, the world was shifting again. The snow muffled the sounds, but Ray's instincts wouldn't rest. He stood and went to the door, scanning the forest once more. Something about this attack didn't sit right. Whoever these men were, they had the tools and the training. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a mission. And that meant the little pup on his floor wasn't just some lost stray. She was connected to something bigger, something dangerous. He grabbed his jacket, preparing to check the shed where the metallic sound had come from the night before. Scout growled low, limping to block his path. "I'm just looking," Ray said, but the old dog didn't budge. The growl deepened, not angry warning. "You smell it too." "Huh?" Ray whispered. He moved to the small side window that faced the shed, keeping low. The door was slightly ajar again, swaying with the wind, but there were new footprints in the snow leading straight to it, fresh, still crisp around the edges. He stepped back slowly. "All right," he muttered. "We're staying put." He slid a chair under the doorknob, checked his rifle's magazine again, and drew the curtains tight. The snow outside was falling harder now, covering the tracks, erasing evidence as quickly as it appeared. Perfect camouflage for anyone wanting to move unseen. Hours passed. The fire dimmed to embers, and Ray's eyes grew heavy. He drifted between wakefulness and dreams haunted by flashes of desert sand explosions and the scent of smoke that always seemed to follow him home. When he jerked awake again, Scout was gone from his spot. Panic surged through him until he heard the soft, scratching sound near the fire. The old dog had crawled across the floor to lie closer to Hope, his body forming a shield around her. The puppy slept soundly, unaware of the sacrifice lying beside her. Scout's breathing was shallow, each inhale a battle, but he refused to move. Ray knelt beside him, tears pricking his eyes. "You're killing yourself," he whispered, voice shaking. Scout opened one eye, meeting his gaze. For a second, Ray saw the same steady look the dog used to give him before running into fire zones during rescue missions, a look that said, if it saves someone, it's worth it. The snow stopped falling by late morning, leaving behind a cold brightness that made everything outside look clean but false, like the land was pretending nothing had happened. Ray Mathers sat at the table, the remnants of his breakfast untouched, his mind, replaying the camera footage of the masked men moving through the fog. Their patterns were too organized, too methodical, the kind of motion drilled into people who'd spent years following orders. These weren't random trespassers. They were trained. He stared out the window at the pale sun struggling through the clouds and muttered, "So what the hell are you after?" The only answer came from the soft padding of paws behind him. He turned to see Hope, trotting unsteadily across the floor, dragging one of Scout's old chew rags behind her like a prize. She was recovering fast stronger with each hour, and her puppy energy filled the room with a strange sense of renewal. Scout followed her slowly, limping, but determined, his eyes tracking her every step. He wasn't her father, but he watched her like one protective, cautious ready. The contrast between the two, the new life barely beginning, and the old one refusing to end, made Ray's chest ache, with a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. He decided to examine Hope more closely that morning. If those men were still searching, it had to be for her, not him. He sat on the floor beside the fire and called softly, "Come here, girl." The puppy trotted over, tail wagging, ears perked. Ray lifted her gently into his lap and rubbed his thumb behind her ear, soothing her until she relaxed completely. That's when he felt it, an irregular patch of skin under the fur, raised slightly, not a scar, but something deliberate. He brushed the fur aside, and there it was, a tiny tattoo, blue-black, against the pale skin reading K947C. He froze his breath, catching in his throat. "What the?" he whispered. Scout lifted his head, sensing the change in Ray's voice. Ray traced the numbers again, disbelief turning slowly into dread. He'd seen marks like this before, back when the Army experimented with service animals that were trained far beyond obedience, animals pushed to the edge of endurance for research no one wanted to talk about. Most of those programs had been shut down years ago. At least that's what he had believed. He stared at the pup, who yawned softly, unbothered, innocent. "What did they do to you, little one?" He murmured, his voice thick. He set her down gently, then walked to the bookshelf where he kept an old storage box full of military clippings and reports. He hadn't touched it in years. Digging through the papers, he found one yellowed article folded inside a medical file. The headline read, "Black Ridge Division disbanded after incident," and the subheading chilled him. "Experimental K9 program terminated after allegations of abuse and genetic breeding failures." He remembered that scandal, vaguely rumors of hybrid training between military and research labs that ended when several dogs escaped the facility during a chemical fire. The report said all surviving animals had been euthanized. But if Hope had a tag that matched that sequence, then the program hadn't truly ended. Someone had kept breeding. Someone still owned her. Ray slammed the folder shut and rubbed his face with both hands, trying to steady his thoughts. The government had wiped its hands clean of Black Ridge years ago, but private contractors could have picked it up quietly. That would explain the men with tranquilizers, the surveillance, the mark behind the ear. Hope wasn't just a dog to them. She was property. "No," he whispered. "Not anymore." He turned toward Scout and the pup, who were lying together again. Hope had found Scout's water bowl and tried to drink, but the rim was too high, and she pawed at it clumsily. Scout, weak but stubborn, nudged the bowl forward with his nose until she could reach. When she finished, he pushed it back, then lowered his head to drink from the same spot. The act was so small, yet so heartbreakingly human, that Ray couldn't stop the lump rising in his throat. "You're still teaching her how to live," he said softly, "even when you can barely stand." The peace didn't last long. A low hum vibrated through the walls, faint but growing. Ray moved to the window and listened. It wasn't wind. It was mechanical, an engine distant but approaching. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. A black SUV crawled along the snowy road a half-mile away, slow enough to suggest caution, not travel. He ducked back inside and shut the door quietly. Scout growled low, confirming what he already knew. "They found us again," Ray muttered. He grabbed his binoculars from the shelf and peered through the smallest gap in the curtain. The vehicle stopped near the bend in the road. Two figures stepped out, both dressed in dark winter gear, faces hidden by masks. They didn't move toward the cabin yet, but one pointed toward the trees as if marking coordinates. The other pulled something from the trunk, a metal case, and crouched beside it. The sunlight caught the lid just enough for Ray to see what was inside tranquilizer darts. His pulse kicked up, but fear wasn't new to him. It had an old, familiar taste. He checked his rifle again and whispered, "If you want her, you'll have to come through me." He moved to the back room, flipping the switch that powered his perimeter alarms. The small motion sensors flickered to life, their tiny green lights steadying one by one. It wasn't much, but it would buy time. He crouched beside Scout and looked into his loyal eyes. "If anything happens," he whispered, "you take her. You hear me? You get her out." The old shepherd let out a soft bark, as if to say he understood, though they both knew he was too weak to run. Still, Ray believed him. Scout had never once failed to keep a promise. An hour passed, maybe two. The men didn't approach directly. Instead, they set something on the road, small, blinking red. A tracker. They were marking the perimeter, waiting for nightfall. Ray cursed under his breath. This wasn't going to be another warning. It was preparation. He moved quietly, packing a small bag with essentials, food, ammunition, water, and the few medical supplies he had left. If they couldn't defend this place, they'd have to abandon it before dusk. He grabbed the worn blanket Hope slept in and folded it into the bag. When he turned back, Scout was struggling to his feet, trying to follow him, despite the pain. The dog's strength was fading, but his spirit refused to break. He stood over Hope's bowl and, with effort, nudged it across the floor toward his own. Ray stopped, frozen by the sight. Scout refused to eat until the puppy did, as though his life had one last mission to make sure she never went hungry again. Hope wagged her tail weakly, pressed her face into his, and began to eat from both bowls, one tiny bite at a time. Ray sank to his knees beside them, emotion hitting him hard. "You're showing me what I forgot, boy," he whispered. "That even when everything's gone, there's still something worth protecting." The sound of a bird startled him from the window. It wasn't a bird. A small drone buzzed overhead, scanning the cabin roof. They were closing in faster than he'd hoped. He grabbed his rifle and whispered, "Time to move." He wrapped Hope in his jacket, lifted Scout's leash, and took one last look around the cabin that had kept them alive. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs. Then he opened the door and stepped into the snow, heading toward the woods, knowing the men behind the trees weren't hunting for a dog anymore. They were hunting for what that dog represented, proof that something inhumane had survived. The forest felt heavier that morning. The kind of weight that comes when you know you're walking into something that might not let you walk back out. Ray Mathers trudged through the snow-covered path with the small puppy tucked inside his jacket, and Scout limping faithfully by his side. The air burned with cold, the wind carrying the smell of pine and decay. They had left the cabin behind before dawn, abandoning what little safety it had offered. The men from the SUV were still out there, maybe closer than he wanted to imagine, and the sound of a drone had buzzed through the trees more than once as they made their escape. Ray's breath came out in thick clouds, each one catching the faint light of morning like steam off a dying fire. Scout's paws sank deep into the snow, but the old dog never hesitated, his focus sharp, even though his body was failing. Every few steps, Ray reached down to touch his fur, just to remind himself the dog was still there, still fighting. He hadn't planned on going back to the place that had started all this. In fact, he had sworn never to return to anything connected with his old life in uniform. But when he'd looked at that tattoo behind Hope's ear, there had only been one name that came to mind: Black Ridge. The facility had been built deep into the hills about 50 miles west, shut down decades ago after a fire that supposedly destroyed every trace of the project. But if Hope carried their mark, then not everything had been buried. There was still something left there, and Ray intended to find it before the men chasing them did. He needed answers not just for her, but for Scout, for everything that had been taken from both of them. The road that led to the facility was almost invisible now, swallowed by nature. Pines had cracked through the asphalt, and snow lay thick over the old security fence. The sign that once read Black Ridge Division Research and Training Complex had rusted so badly that the words were barely legible. Ray stopped beside it, his breath slowing. Scout stared up at the gates with a low, uneasy growl. "Yeah," Ray said quietly. "I don't like it either." He pushed open a section of the fence that sagged low to the ground and slipped through. Inside, the air felt wrong too, still too empty. The smell of metal and rot clung to the wind. As they moved deeper in, the remains of buildings began to appear: concrete shells with holes in their roofs, shattered windows, and scattered debris half buried in snow. Hope stirred inside his jacket, letting out a faint whimper. "Easy," he murmured. "We're almost there." He stopped in front of what used to be the main kennel block. The double doors hung crooked, one barely attached to its hinges. Ray pulled the flashlight from his pocket and stepped inside the beam, cutting through the dim interior. Dust particles swirled in the light like ghosts. The smell hit him instantly: old disinfectant, wet rust, and something faintly chemical. He moved slowly, scanning the rows of empty cages. Each one had a small brass plate engraved with numbers, not names. Some were dented, others burned black from the fire. A few still had broken collars chained to the bars. "My God," he whispered. Scout stopped near one of the cages and sniffed the ground tail low. His body tensed, and then he let out a sharp bark. Ray turned toward him just as Scout's paw hit something metallic buried in the dust. Ray knelt down and brushed away the dirt, revealing a thin metal plate the size of a dog tag. The engraving was almost too faded to read, but when the light hit it just right, the name surfaced: Scout. Ray froze. His throat tightened. He picked up the tag and turned it over, and there, stamped faintly beneath the name, was the same code as Hope's tattoo, K947C. "No," he breathed, shaking his head. "You were here. Before." He looked down at Scout, who stared back with those calm, dark eyes that seemed to know everything already. The old shepherd took a slow step forward and looked up toward the far wall. Ray followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. Lining the entire length of the wall were hundreds of metal tags, each nailed there in neat rows. Some were rusted beyond recognition, others still bore names or codes: K943, AK945, BK946A. Every one of them represented a life used and discarded. Scout's low whine filled the silence. He stepped closer to the wall, nose brushing one of the tag's tail limp. For the first time since the storm, Ray saw tears form in his own eyes. "You weren't just rescued," he whispered. "You escaped." The sound of wind whistled through the broken windows, echoing like distant cries. Ray clenched the tag in his hand and looked around the kennel. On a table near the back, several file boxes lay half-burned, some still intact. He flipped open the first one, coughing as dust rose in clouds. Inside were medical records, photographs, and reports stamped "Terminated" across the top in red ink. He scanned the first page. Subject 47. C. Female crossbreed. Enhanced olfactory response. Classified for long-term testing. Status: successful adaptation. The rest of the sentence was blacked out. The next file listed numbers up to 47. G, all terminated except 147C status pending. "That's her," he whispered, looking down at Hope, whose small head poked from his jacket, watching him with wide eyes. "You're the one they couldn't kill." He turned the flashlight towards the far wall and saw a map pinned there, edges curled from age. It showed the facility layout, kennels, labs, and something called Sub-Level 3 Behavioral Control. The section was circled in red. A creak echoed from somewhere above. Ray froze, turning off the flashlight. Scout lifted his head, ears twitching. The creak came again, closer. This time someone was walking on the second floor. Ray moved silently toward the doorway, pressing his back against the wall. He listened. 2 sets of footsteps. Heavy boots. The men had followed the tire tracks just as he feared. He could hear faint radio static, a whisper of voices he couldn't make out. He glanced at Scout, who stared at him with unwavering focus. Ray pointed toward the far corridor, signaling retreat. They slipped down the narrow passage that led deeper into the building. The smell of burnt plastic grew stronger as they descended a set of stairs into the basement level. Each step echoed too loudly in the still air. Down there, the darkness was absolute. Ray switched the flashlight back on its beam, catching rows of metal crates and shattered glass containers. The place looked like it had been abandoned mid-evacuation. Papers covered the floor like snowdrifts. On one overturned table, a folder lay open with photos clipped inside images of dogs, wired to medical equipment notes, written in a language of science Ray wished he couldn't read. He flipped the page and froze. There was a picture of Scout Younger, leaner eyes filled with confusion. The caption beneath read, Subject 46, B combat conditioning incomplete. Result non-compliant. Termination recommended. But the record hadn't been stamped. The line below read, escaped during fire, presumed deceased. Ray clenched the paper in his fist, heartbreaking and burning all at once. You weren't a stray, he whispered to the old shepherd. You were running from hell. Scout pressed his head against Ray's leg as if to confirm it. Above them, the sound of boots drew closer. Dust fell from the ceiling. They were sweeping the rooms. Ray killed the light again and pulled Scout behind a stack of crates. He could hear muffled conversation, one voice young, impatient, the other calm, commanding. Search the sub-level, the older one said. If the girl dog's chip is active, she's close. Ray's blood ran cold. They were tracking Hope's implant. He reached into his pack, fumbling for his knife, and carefully cut the small transmitter out of the pup's collar. The device blinked faintly before going dark. That's done, he whispered. The men's footsteps faded again, moving toward the upper level. When silence returned, Ray let out a shaky breath. He turned to Scout and said, We need to finish this. The cold wind sliced through the ruins of Black Ridge as Ray Mathers crouched behind the remnants of a concrete barrier, gripping his rifle so tight that his knuckles turned white. The roar of engines from above had faded, but not far enough. He could still hear the faint clatter of boots on the gravel road that led to the facility entrance, men shouting orders in short bursts, the occasional metallic clink of equipment being loaded or readied. The soldiers or hunters, as they seemed to be, had followed him here exactly as he'd expected. He had hoped to reach the truth before they arrived, but now the truth was closing around him like a noose. Scout limped beside him, fur streaked with soot and ash, nose twitching with every new sound. The old shepherd's eyes were sharp. Despite his exhaustion, his body hunched in that soldierly stance that said he knew they were cornered, but hadn't accepted defeat. Ray looked down at the small shape tucked under his arm. Hope barely awake, breathing shallow, her body trembling in rhythm with his pulse. We've got to move, Ray whispered. The wind caught his voice and carried it through the broken halls. Scout growled softly, turning his head toward the southern corridor. They moved quickly, the crunch of glass under their boots echoing too loudly in the silence. Ray knew the building's layout by heart, now burned into memory from the maps he'd found earlier. The sublevel extended beneath the old training wing, a place marked as behavioral control. If there were answers to what Hope truly was, they would be down there. But it was a trap, waiting to spring, and he knew it. Still doing nothing wasn't an option. The snow outside would slow him, and those men would be closing in from every direction. The only path left was through the belly of the place that had created this nightmare. He found the rusted stairwell leading down and took one cautious step, then another, his boots squeaking against metal. The air grew colder, heavier, tasting faintly of chemicals and iron. Scout followed close, every movement deliberate, every breath a soft rasp. The corridor below was long and narrow, lined with cracked tiles and broken lights that hung like dead stars. The smell intensified the farther they went. Decay and disinfectant fused into something that made Ray's stomach tighten. He swept the flashlight across the walls, its beam landing on faded warning signs: biohazard containment area, do not enter. The words no longer scared him. What scared him was how normal they felt now, how familiar. He reached a locked metal door halfway down and pressed his hand against it. It didn't move. Scout sniffed along the bottom edge, ears twitching, tail low. "You smell it too," Ray whispered. He glanced at the hinges. They were old, corroded, ready to give. He raised the rifle and fired one short burst at the lock. The metal split with a sharp crack. He shoved the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, maybe a control office once. Monitors lined one wall, dead screens coated in dust. A single desk sat in the corner. Papers scattered across it, the edges curled from dampness. He set Hope gently on the chair and began rifling through the papers, searching for anything legible. Most were rotted, but one sheet still held ink. It read, Subject 47, see behavioral variance protective instinct exceeding expected parameters. Recommendation, isolate or terminate. He exhaled slowly, a knot forming in his chest. Protective instinct, he repeated softly, glancing at the pup. That's why they couldn't finish you. You weren't broken, you were too loyal. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Scout sniffed the ground again, pawing at a spot near the back wall. What is it, boy? Ray asked. The dog's claws scratched against the tile until a hollow sound answered back. Ray knelt beside him and cleared away debris, revealing a square metal hatch embedded in the floor, its handle rusted but intact. Well, I'll be damned, he whispered. He tugged at it, muscles straining, and finally pried it open. A ladder descended into pitch blackness. A draft of frigid air wafted up, carrying the scent of mold and earth. He aimed the flashlight down corrugated walls, cables, maybe another lab beneath this one. He hesitated, his instincts screaming to leave, but the faint echo of voices above told him there was no turning back. He scooped up Hope, nodded to Scout, and started down. Each rung groaned beneath his weight. When they reached the bottom, the beam of the flashlight revealed rows of crates stacked high and sealed with government stamps long faded by time. The floor was damp, footprints etched in mud, leading deeper into the shadows. Ray crouched and brushed one of the footprints with his hand. Fresh, not old. His breath caught. Someone had been down here recently. He turned to Scout, who was already staring down the corridor, body stiff, tail rigid. Stay close, Ray whispered. They crept forward until they reached a wide-open space that must once have been the central testing area. The ceiling lights flickered weakly, one by one, triggered by the motion sensors still somehow connected to backup power. The sudden glow cast long shadows across the concrete walls. And that's when he saw him. A tall man in a black coat stepped out from behind a row of crates, a pistol raised loosely in one hand. His hair was gray at the temples, his face lined, but calm, his eyes unnervingly familiar. You shouldn't have brought them back, the man said evenly, his voice echoing. Ray raised his rifle halfway but didn't fire. Who the hell are you? He demanded. The man tilted his head slightly. Someone who tried to stop this before it began, he replied. But they buried the files and they buried me with them. His gaze shifted to Hope. That dog doesn't belong to you. You have no idea what she is. Ray took a step forward, keeping his voice steady. I know exactly what she is. She's alive. That's all that matters. The man sighed, almost regretful. Alive is the problem. Every one of those animals was built to protect, but when they failed their handlers, they turned on them. You think loyalty is their nature? It's programming gone wrong. Ray shook his head. Disbelief mingled with fury. You're lying. I've seen her. I've seen what she is. She's not a weapon. The man tightened his grip on the pistol. They said the same about her mother. Before Ray could react, a low growl erupted from his side. Scout moved forward, placing himself between Ray and the stranger teeth, bared hackles raised. "Don't," Ray warned, lowering his hand, but the old shepherd wasn't listening. The man's eyes narrowed. "That one he said nodding at Scout was one of ours, too. We thought he burned with the rest. I guess I was wrong." Ray's heart thudded painfully. The pieces clicked together, the tag, the photo, the files. Scout had once belonged to these people. They had made him, then left him to die. The man aimed the gun directly at Scout. "I can fix that mistake right now." The shot never came. Before the man could pull the trigger, Hope whimpered a small, frightened sound that pierced the air. Scout lunged instantly faster than Ray thought his battered body could move. The old dog hit the man's arm, knocking the pistol wide. The shot went off, echoing through the chamber, a spark flashing against the wall. The man stumbled, dropping the gun. Scout stood over him, growling low, every muscle trembling from strain. The man looked up, shock, and something almost like sorrow flashing across his face. "Still following your instinct," he muttered, "even when it kills you." Ray grabbed the rifle, training it on the man's chest. "You're not going to hurt them," he said. "Not again." The man raised his hands slowly. "You don't understand," he said. "If you walk out of here with her, they'll never stop. They'll burn everything to erase her existence. And you along with her." The wind above Black Ridge screamed through broken windows, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke and melting metal. Ray Mathers could hear the faint roar of the fire below them, a beast devouring the ruins from the inside out. Every breath seared his throat, the air thick with ash. He held Hope close to his chest, her tiny body trembling beneath his jacket, and turned toward the staircase that led to the surface. Scout limped beside him, bleeding from his shoulder and ribs, yet still alert, still guarding. Behind them, the sound of cracking steel grew louder, echoing like gunfire through the collapsing corridors. The explosion had started when the bullet fired during the struggle hit one of the gas lines buried under the concrete floor. The scientist had screamed something about containment before the fire swallowed him. Now there was no containment left, no safety, only a growing inferno that wanted everything. Ray stumbled through the smoke, coughing hard, vision blurring. "Come on, boy," he rasped. "We're not dying here." Scout barked once, the sound hoarse but defiant, and pushed forward. They reached the stairwell, but half of it was gone, collapsed into a heap of twisted rebar and fire. Heat licked upward through the gaps, glowing red like the mouth of hell itself. The ceiling trembled under the pressure, small chunks of plaster raining down. Ray looked up toward the next landing. It wasn't far, maybe 8 feet, but the climb would be slow, and Scout's strength was fading fast. He glanced at the old shepherd, who stood steady despite his wounds. "You first, old man," Ray said, crouching low. Scout hesitated, eyes flicking to Hope, then back to Ray. "I'll carry her. You climb." The dog seemed to understand. He stepped back, gathered what little power was left in his legs, and leapt. His front paws caught the ledge claws, scraping against the metal, and with a growl of effort he pulled himself up. Ray followed quickly, one arm holding the pup, the other hauling his body upward. The metal burned through his gloves, but he didn't stop until his boots hit solid ground again. The hallway above was choked with smoke, but light flickered ahead, an emergency exit sign still glowing weakly. They moved fast, stumbling over debris, the building trembling around them. Every wall seemed to groan, every beam bending under the heat. Ray knew the place was minutes from collapse. The memory of the scientist's final words haunted him with every step. They'll never stop, but he couldn't think about that now. There was only one goal: get out alive. They reached a set of double doors, warped by the fire. Ray threw his shoulder into them again and again until they burst open. Cold air rushed in, freezing against his sweat-soaked face. Snowflakes swirled in through the smoke, turning to steam as they hit the flames behind him. He stumbled outside, into the open night, gasping eyes stinging. Scout followed, limping but unbroken, his fur streaked with soot. Behind them, the Black Ridge facility burned in a violent storm of orange and red flames, clawing at the sky like a monster unleashed. The sound of it was endless, the roar of something ancient dying. Ray dropped to his knees in the snow, clutching Hope close, feeling her heartbeat flutter against his chest. For a moment the world tilted, the exhaustion, the pain, the grief pressing down all at once. Then Scout appeared beside him, breathing hard, but still upright. The old dog looked back toward the burning ruins, his eyes reflecting the flames. "It's over," Ray said softly, though they both knew it wasn't. The truth was nothing about this would ever be over. The people who made these animals, the people who sent killers to erase them, they would come again. But as Ray looked at the puppy in his arms, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt purpose. "You hear that, girl?" he murmured. "You're free now." A deep rumble shook the ground, and Ray's head snapped up. The explosion below must have triggered another gas pocket. Flames burst from the facility's upper windows, sending a wave of heat across the clearing. A piece of burning debris launched into the air and came crashing down toward them. Ray shouted, throwing his body over the puppy. But Scout moved faster. The old shepherd lunged, knocking Ray sideways, and threw himself over Hope just as the flaming debris hit the snow beside them. The blast of heat rolled over them like a furnace. Ray scrambled up, grabbing the rifle and shoving the debris aside, but the smell of burned fur hit him before he saw it. "Scout," he yelled, voice cracking. The dog was lying still, his body curved protectively around the puppy smoke rising from his back. Hope whimpered beneath him unharmed. Ray dropped beside him, hands shaking. "No, not now," he whispered. Scout opened one eye, cloudy but calm. His chest rose and fell unevenly. The dog's gaze shifted from Ray to Hope, then back again. And for a moment everything else fell away, the fire, the snow, the sound of death consuming the valley. There was only that look, steady, and knowing the same look Scout had given him years ago on the battlefield before charging into the smoke to drag a wounded man back. Ray felt his throat close. "You did it again," he said hoarsely. "You saved us." Scout's breathing hitched, his body trembling, but he still lifted his head, pressing his nose gently against Hope's tiny paw. The puppy licked his muzzle, once confused but tender. Then Scout exhaled, slow and long, his body relaxing completely. The rise and fall of his chest stopped. Ray sat there in the snow, the world dissolving into silence except for the crackle of burning wood. He reached out and rested his hand on the dog's side, feeling the last trace of warmth fading under his palm. "You were never a weapon," he whispered. "You were the best damn soul I ever knew." Hope whimpered softly and curled herself against Scout's still body tail, twitching as if trying to wake him. Ray wiped at his face, but the tears came anyway, hot and unrelenting. He stayed like that for a long time until the fire began to die down behind them, and the sky turned gray with dawn. When he finally stood, he lifted Scout's body gently and carried him toward the tree line, away from the smoke, away from the ghosts of the facility. He found a small rise overlooking the valley, a spot untouched by the flames, and began to dig with his hands, the frozen earth tearing at his skin. Hope sat beside him, watching silently. When the grave was deep enough, he laid Scout down inside, wrapping him in his own army jacket. He set the metal tag he had taken from the wall earlier on the dog's chest. The tag gleamed faintly in the morning light. "You're free now, soldier," Ray whispered. "Rest easy." He covered the grave slowly, each handful of dirt falling heavier than the last. When it was done, he sat beside it, exhausted, his fingers raw and bleeding. Hope climbed into his lap, pressing her head under his chin. Ray looked down at her and smiled through the ache. "He'd want me to take care of you," he said softly, "and I will. For both of you." The dawn came gray and hollow, the kind of light that made the world look washed clean but not forgiven. The fire at Black Ridge had burned itself into silence, leaving behind a field of smoke and twisted metal that rose into the air like ghosts refusing to leave. Ray Mathers stood beside the fresh mound of earth where he had buried Scout beneath the lone pine tree overlooking the valley. His hands were raw from digging, his breath visible in the cold, but he didn't feel the pain anymore. The ache that lived inside him now was quieter, heavier, the kind that doesn't scream, it just stays. Hope sat at his feet, her fur still streaked with soot, her tiny frame shivering but alive. She looked up at the grave, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for Scout to wake. "He's not coming back," Kid Ray murmured, voice breaking. "But he's watching, I promise you that." He brushed snow from the wooden cross he'd built, the crude carving of Scout's name etched by his pocket knife. The pine needles above swayed gently, whispering as the wind passed through them, and for a fleeting second it almost sounded like breathing. Ray reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Scout's collar, the leather still warm from the dog's fur. The tag attached to it clinked softly against the metal buckle, the same one he'd taken from the wall inside the facility. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the rough edges, the history it carried. Something about the tag felt thicker than normal, as though the metal plate wasn't solid. He frowned, squinting at it. The back wasn't sealed. It had a faint seam running along the edge. Instinct took over. He pulled out his knife and pried at the seam until it gave way with a soft click. Inside, wedged between the two layers of metal, was a small, black microchip no larger than a fingernail. His heart kicked hard in his chest. "You old genius," he whispered, realization dawning. "You kept it hidden all this time." He held the chip up to the light, the morning sun glinting off its smooth surface. It was military-grade storage, the kind used for encrypted data, impossible to find unless you knew it was there. Scout must have carried it since the day he escaped Black Ridge, carrying their secrets under his collar like a silent witness. Ray's hands shook as he slid the chip into the reader slot on his portable field tablet, the one piece of tech he hadn't sold when he left service. The screen flickered, then filled with lines of code and file names: Project Black Ridge, subject logs, funding sources, operative command. His throat tightened. He opened one file at random and froze. There were photos, dogs in cages, notes detailing behavioral manipulation reports about chemical exposure tests. One image stopped him cold Scout years younger, standing inside a containment pen, eyes bright and unbroken. The caption read, "Subject 46, B displays. Elevated loyalty response to non-human stimuli. Potentially useful for training secondary subjects." The next file listed Hope's lineage 47C, the direct offspring of 46B. His breath caught. "You were his kid," he whispered, staring at the puppy by his side. "He wasn't just protecting you out of instinct. He knew." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Scout hadn't just found Hope by chance. He had known exactly what she was and where she came from. He had gone back into that storm bleeding and dying to save his own bloodline, the only piece of innocence left from a life built on cruelty. Ray looked at the grave again, the weight of that realization breaking him in a way he hadn't expected. "You knew she was yours," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "You couldn't save yourself, but you made damn sure she'd live." The wind picked up scattering pine needles across the fresh soil. The air carried the faintest sound of the mountain's echo, low and mournful. Ray wiped at his face, then turned his focus back to the tablet. He scrolled through the documents, uncovering lists of financial backers, private contractors, defense companies, even medical firms. Names he recognized from his days in the service names that had sat in boardrooms, while soldiers like him and dogs like Scout paid the price. The last document was a directive dated 2 years earlier, Operation Closure. Target all remaining subjects of Project Black Ridge. Objective locate and neutralize. Status ongoing. His stomach twisted. The men who had hunted them weren't acting alone. They were still being paid to finish what the government wanted erased. He knew what this meant. Now the hunters would keep coming until every trace of Black Ridge was gone. That included Hope. He closed the tablet, staring into the distance where the ruins still smoldered. "They think they buried their sins," he muttered, voice low. "But you left the evidence right here, didn't you, boy?" He placed the tablet and chip back into his pack, cinched it tight, and knelt beside the grave again. "You did your part, Scout. Now it's on me." The pine branches creaked overhead, snow shaking loose from the weight. Ray reached out and brushed his fingers over the mound, whispering a quiet prayer he hadn't spoken in decades. "Rest now, soldier. You've done enough." Hope moved closer, her small paw resting on the mound of dirt. She looked up at Ray, eyes wide and wet. Then, without warning, she lifted her head and let out a long, trembling howl. The sound was thin, fragile, almost human in its sorrow. It carried through the valley, rising above the quiet, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Ray froze. He hadn't heard that kind of sound since Scout's first night home years ago, when the dog had cried under the same moon after being rescued from the side of the road. It was the same voice, the same ache passed down through blood and memory. The howl grew louder, steadier, the kind of sound that doesn't just fill the air, but cuts straight through you. And something inside Ray broke open. He dropped to his knees beside her, pulling the puppy close as tears spilled down his cheeks. "It's okay," he whispered, though his voice shook. "He hears you." The wind rushed through the trees, bending the pine branches, and for a second it almost sounded like an answer, soft, distant, but real. Hope pressed her face into his chest, her small body trembling, her cry fading into quiet whimpers. Ray held her tighter, his tears falling into her fur. "We'll make it mean something," he said softly. "I promise." He stayed there for what felt like hours, the world around him frozen in that single moment of grief and promise. When the sun finally climbed higher, the light caught on Scout's tag, still hanging from the wooden cross, and reflected a thin golden line across the snow. Ray took that as a sign it was time to move. He stood his body stiff and cold and looked down one last time at the grave. "You're still with us," he murmured. "Always." Hope barked once, as if echoing his words, her voice small but sure. The mountain roads were clearer now, the snow receding into soft gray patches that melted under the weight of spring rain. 3 months had passed since the night the fires of Black Ridge painted the sky red, and the world had slowly begun to take notice of the truth buried beneath its ashes. Ray Mathers sat at the corner of a cafe in a small Wyoming town. His hat pulled low, watching the news unfold on the television above the counter. The headline stretched across the bottom of the screen, in sharp letters, "Secret Military Program Exposed, Black Ridge Division Files Leaked Online." The anchor's voice trembled with urgency as footage played behind her, showing photographs Ray had once seen on his own tablet, images of cages, experiments, and the faces of men in suits who had thought their crimes would never surface. One by one, their names scrolled across the screen: generals, CEOs, government contractors. People who had ordered loyalty to be engineered, who had turned living creatures into tools. Now they were running out of places to hide. Ray sipped his coffee slowly, his hand steady despite the tremor in his heart. He hadn't done it for vengeance. He'd done it because Scout deserved peace, and because Hope deserved a future free from the shadow that had created her. When he sent those files to every major news outlet 2 weeks ago, he hadn't expected it to take on a life of its own. But truth had a way of spreading faster than bullets once it finally escaped the silence meant to cage it. The door opened with a small jingle of bells, and a soft bark echoed from outside. Ray smiled faintly before turning around. Hope bounded in through the door, her coat sleek and healthy, now her paws leaving faint prints on the wooden floor. She was larger than before, but still carried that same spark in her eyes, the one that had saved them both. She stopped beside him, tail wagging, and nudged his arm with her nose. "Yeah, I saw it," Ray said quietly, setting his cup down. "They can't bury it anymore." Hope tilted her head, as if understanding. She had changed so much in 3 months, no longer the fragile creature trembling under Scout's body, but a survivor, lean and strong, the kind of dog who made people stop and look twice. Her collar jingled softly as she moved the metal tag, catching the light. It wasn't Scout's old one. Ray had buried that where it belonged. This one bore a new nameplate: Hope Mathers. They left the cafe and stepped into the street where the morning sun cut through the fog. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, familiar and clean. People passed them with polite smiles, unaware that the quiet man with the weathered face had just changed the course of something far larger than himself. Ray didn't need their recognition. The only monument he wanted already existed, waiting down the road near the edge of town. As he and Hope walked toward it, the gravel crunched beneath their feet in a rhythm that matched his heart, steady, certain, alive. The new rescue center stood where the old shelter used to be, a simple wooden building painted white with a green roof. A banner stretched across its front fence: Scout's Haven, a place for second chances. Ray paused at the gate, eyes stinging. He hadn't chosen the name. The volunteers had. Word of what had happened at Blackridge had reached every corner of the animal welfare world, and donations had poured in. People wanted to help to undo a fraction of what had been done. He stepped through the gate and Hope trotted beside him. The yard was filled with movement-rescued dogs running, barking, playing in the open field. For the first time, Ray saw freedom that wasn't just a word. At the center of the courtyard stood the statue. It wasn't grand or polished, just simple bronze catching the morning light. It depicted a German shepherd sitting tall, his head slightly turned, as though he were watching over the place. Beneath him, etched into the stone base, were words that made Ray's throat close. In memory of Scout loyalty never dies. It just teaches us how to live. He stood there for a long moment, unable to move. Hope circled the statue, once sniffed the base, and then sat beside it, tail brushing against the stone. She looked up at the sculpture with those familiar eyes, and for a heartbeat, Ray swore he saw the ghost of her father in her stance. The same posture, the same quiet dignity. He reached down and rested a hand on her head. "He'd be proud of you," he said softly. "You kept his promise." Around them, volunteers called to dogs, laughter rising like music. Life moved on. Yet for Ray, time had slowed into something sacred. He knelt beside the statue and set down a small wooden box he had carried in his pack. Inside lay the last piece of the data chip, the fragment he had kept as a reminder. He opened it one last time, staring at the small sliver of black metal before placing it at the statue's base. "We don't need this anymore," he whispered. "The world finally knows. Let them fight over their guilt while we keep what matters." He stood again, watching, as Hope pressed her paw gently against the stone where the box sat. The gesture was small, but deliberate, as if sealing the past. Ray looked out across the field beyond the rescue center, where the hills rolled endlessly toward the horizon. He thought about everything that had led him here. The storms, the fire, the graves, the faces of the men who thought control was stronger than compassion. They had created dogs to obey. But what had survived wasn't obedience, it was love. The thing they had tried to erase was the only thing that endured. He felt the weight of that truth settle into him like sunlight breaking through clouds. They tried to build protectors. He murmured, his hand still on Hope's head. But what they made instead was proof that love doesn't need orders. Hope barked once, sharp and clear, startling a few birds from the trees. They soared upward, scattering into the blue. Ray smiled, the first genuine smile he'd allowed himself in years. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and open air filling his lungs, and let the tension of the past finally release. "Come on," he said gently, turning toward the path that led down to the lake. "Let's go see the world he saved for you." Hope bounded ahead, her paws kicking up dust and sunlight, the wind catching her fur in bright flashes of gold and white. Ray followed slower, but steady, his heart lighter with every step. As they reached the edge of the water, the reflection of the sky shimmered across the surface. Hope ran to the shoreline, barking at her own reflection, and Ray laughed quietly, the sound surprising even him. He sat on a rock nearby, watching her chase the waves. The peace that settled over him wasn't the fragile kind that breaks when you breathe. It was the lasting kind built from pain endured and love proven. The past would always be there, etched into his memories and the soil beneath the pine tree, but now it existed beside something new, the promise of life continuing. When the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Ray rose and called out, "Come on, girl. Time to go home." Hope turned ears perked, then ran toward him, leaping into his arms. He caught her easily despite the stiffness in his joints, laughing again as she licked his face. "You're getting heavy," he said, though he didn't mean it as a complaint. He looked back once toward the distant hills, where a faint breeze carried the scent of smoke, long gone. For a moment he could almost hear the soft padding of old paws keeping pace beside them, invisible, but not gone. He whispered, "You did it, boy. You kept us safe. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes loyalty never dies. Tell us in the comments what part hit you the hardest, And where in the world you're watching from, we love seeing how far these stories travel.